Hey friends, today before we start in our math journal, I want to show you this little chart that usually hangs in my classroom. And I will post this on Google Classroom under math resources so that you can use that if you need to. It's kind of a way for us to kind of box in the place that we're trying to round. So yesterday or Tuesday, we worked on rounding to the nearest hundred. So what you would do is you would find the place and box it in. So we would box in the hundreds place. Then you're going to look next door. Remember, you're going to look to the right. If that number is 5 or bigger, you're going to add one more. But notice I boxed this in as well because you're going to add one more to the place that you boxed. Okay, so it's like you're adding a group. If that number is 4 or less, you're going to let it rest. You're going to leave it alone. Okay, it'll make more sense here when I show you on this chart. If we're rounding to the nearest hundred, we're going to box in the hundreds place. So here's the number 134. 100, the 1 is our hundreds place. So we're going to box that in. Then we're going to look next door. So we're going to look to the tens place. And we have to decide, is that 5 or bigger? If it is, we're going to add 1 to what we boxed in. If it's 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. We're going to leave it alone. We're going to leave this alone. Okay, so I know I've boxed in 100. This number is 4 or less, so we're going to leave this one alone. So 134 rounded to the nearest hundred would be 100 because we're going to keep this number the same. Look at this one, 187. We've boxed the 100. We're looking next door and look at it's 5 or bigger. So we're going to add one more to what we boxed. So this 1 is going to become a 2. So 187 rounded to the nearest hundred is going to be 200. I added to this that I boxed. So 1 plus 1 more is 2. So it rounds to 200. This number is 25, and we're rounding it to the nearest hundred. I boxed in my hundreds place, but I don't have any hundreds. So that's really an imaginary 0 in there, right? I still have to look next door because I've boxed my hundreds place. That is 4 or less, so I'm going to leave this alone. So I'm not going to round up. I'm going to keep it the same. So 25 rounded to the nearest hundred would be 0 because 25 is between 0 and 100 on that number line. This one, I boxed in 2 digits. Look at that. We know that the 5 is in the hundreds place, right? And this is the thousands place. But really, for 1,000, I have 10 of my hundreds, right? Those big flats, this is 100. So to get 1,000, I have 10 of these. So this is 10 hundreds, and 500s make 15 hundreds. So that's why I've boxed in both of those. So I'm going to do the same thing. Look next door. It's an 8, so it's 5 or bigger. I'm going to add 1 more. So instead of 15 hundreds, now 1,582, my 15 hundreds is now 1,600, or 1,600 is another way to say that. So that's how we round to the nearest hundred. Okay, we're going to work on a word problem, and then we're going to learn about rounding to the nearest 10. So remember, in your math journal, we left off on page 196. So pause the video, open your journal to page 196. Okay, we're going to look at number 13 today. This is last week. Mrs. Larson drove 191 miles on Monday, 225 miles on Wednesday, and 107 miles on Friday. About, remember there's that key word, about, that tells me we're going to estimate about how many miles did she drive altogether. Okay, I'm not asking exactly how many did she drive. Then I would just add those numbers together. I want to know about how many, so I'm going to estimate. The directions tell me to solve by rounding to the nearest hundred. So I have to take all of those numbers and round them to the nearest hundred. So 191 Remember, if I'm rounding to the nearest hundred, I'm going to box that in. If you're having trouble, that's what you can do. I'm going to look next door. That number is 5 or more, so I'm going to add a group. So 191 rounded to the nearest hundred would round to 200. How about the next number? 225. If I box my hundreds, I have two hundreds. I look next door. Oh, that's a small number. Remember, it's less than 4. I'm going to leave this alone. I'm going to let it rest. So it's going to stay at 200. So 225 rounded to the nearest hundred would round to 200. Let's try the last one. 107 miles. So here's my 100, my hundreds place. I look next door. Oh, that number is definitely less than 4, right? 4 or less. I'm going to let it rest. I'm not going to change this. So 107 rounded to the nearest hundred would round to 100. So now I can answer the question. About how many miles did she drive altogether? I'm going to add together the numbers that I rounded, right? Start with my ones, add my tens, and I'm going to add my hundreds. 2 and 2 gives me 4 hundreds, plus one more gives me 5 hundreds. So how many miles did she drive altogether? Remember that label is miles. We're going to put 500 miles. Now that's doing that with a word problem. The bottom of our page, we're going to use rounding again to decide if the answer is reasonable, meaning that's like, that makes sense. If it's unreasonable, it does not make sense. Okay, and you're going to write your estimate, and then you're going to write yes or no. So you have to do two different things here. You have to first decide if it's reasonable, and then you have to decide yes or no. Okay? So if I have 604, and I'm going to take away 180, they're telling me I'm going to get this for my answer. I'm not doing that subtraction problem. I'm rounding to see, is this a reasonable answer? So if I have 604, and I'm going to round that to the nearest hundred, because that's what we're working on, right? Boxing in my 100, looking next door, what do you think? Are we going to add one, or are we going to leave it alone, let it rest? 604 rounded to the nearest hundred would be 600. Here's 180. If I were to round 180, what do you think I'm going to do? 180 rounded to the nearest hundred would be 200. Okay, so I've rounded those numbers. Now I can subtract 600 minus 200. So here is my estimate. I'm saying it's about 400. So my answer is about 400. They're telling me it's 586. Are those close at all? No, those are pretty far apart. That's a big mistake, right? So no, this is not a reasonable answer. Okay, you're going to see some problems like this on your homework. So you're not simply subtracting to see if this is the correct answer. You're rounding and then figuring out if this is reasonable or not. Okay, so think about, they've made a mistake somewhere. You don't want to make the same one. We're going to move to page 197 today. Okay. We're going to round to the nearest 10 this time. Let me pull my chart back out. I showed you this earlier. We rounded to the nearest 100. Now, when we're rounding to the nearest 10, we're going to box in the tens place. That's why it's so important that you know your place value. So for example, this number is 23. I know that the 2 is in my tens place. I'm still going to look next door, but it's different than before. I was looking at the tens place before. Now I'm going to look to the ones place. I have 2 tens. Look at that one is 3. It's less than 4. I'm going to leave this alone. So now 23 rounded to the nearest 10 would be 20, because now my hops are not 100. My hops are only 10 in between. So from 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, we're hopping by tens. It's next number, 28. I boxed in my tens place. I'm looking next door. That number's 5 or bigger, so I'm going to add one more. But remember, I'm adding the 1 to what I've boxed. So 28 rounded to the nearest 10 is going to round to 30. Get this one. We had one like this before. The number is 5, but I have to box in the tens place. I don't have any, but I still have to show that place boxed in so that I can go next door. Okay, so 5 is bigger, right? 5 or bigger, add one more. So I'm going to add to this, add 0. Now I have 110, and here's my proof. 5 rounded to the nearest 10 is 10. This number is 2. Same thing, only now it's 4 or less. I'm going to let this rest. So I'm not going to change that number in there. Remember, you know that that number is 0. So 2 rounded to the nearest 10 would be 0, because on a number line, 2 is closer to 0 than it is to 10. Remember, we're hopping by tens. Finally, 136. I boxed my tens, right? 3 tens and 100, right? But I know that this is 10 tens because there are 10 10 sticks. So here's 10 tens plus my 3 tens gives me 13 tens. I'm looking next door. 6 is bigger than 5, so I'm going to move from 13 tens to 14 tens, which is the same as 140. So 136 rounded to the nearest 10 would be 140. Okay, so we're thinking only hopping by tens. This would be in between 130 and 140 on our number line. We would hop to 140 because it's closer to that number, right? So thinking about rounding to the nearest tens today, we're going to look at page 197. I'm not going to do all these. It's a lot on here, okay? But you're going to have some homework to work on today where you're going to be rounding. So let's start with number 3, 78. If I'm going to box my tens and look next door, that's bigger, right, than 5. So I'm going to change that from a 7 to an 8. I'm going to add 1. But remember, we're only hopping to the nearest 10. So starting on that number line, at 0, hopping to 10, 20, 30, 40, right? We could go into 510, 520, 530. So we're only hopping to the nearest 10, tens place. Let's try number 6. 89 is the number. Box in my tens place. Think about that. 89 on a number line is going to be between 80 and 90. If I get out my secret code cards and I have 89, I have 8 tens. The next one would be 9 tens. So it's in between. Which one is it closest to? Because that number is 5 or bigger, I'm going to add one more to my tens. So it's closest to 90. Okay, let's try number 8. 92. 9 tens. That's 4 or less. I'm going to let it rest. I'm going to leave it alone. So 92 rounded to the nearest 10 is also 90, just like the one above. Okay, let's challenge ourselves a little bit. This one now is rounding 3-digit numbers. Okay, but we're still rounding to the nearest tens place. So you've got to really pay attention to those directions. Let's look at number 9. 162. Okay, so I'm thinking about rounding to the nearest 10. I want to box in my tens. And remember, I do have 6 tens, but 1 group of 100, remember, is 10 tens. So I really have 16 tens. So if I'm going to look next door, am I going to change anything? Is my 16 going to get 1 added to it, or am I going to leave it alone? Good thinking. 162 rounded to the nearest 10, we rounded to 160. Let's try number 12. 255. Okay, I know that I have 5 tens, but I have 2 hundreds, right? So I have 2 of these, right? 2 of those. So here's 10, here's 20, plus my 5 more. So I really have 25 tens. What do you think? 5 or bigger. Add 1 more. So instead of having 25 tens, I'm going to have 26 tens instead. So 255 rounded to the nearest 10 would round to 260. Because remember, 255 is between 250 and 260 because we're counting and hopping by tens. So keep that in mind. Let's try one more. Number 15, 503. Okay, box your tens. You might say, well, I don't have any tens. Well, you don't in the tens place. But remember, a group of 100 means 10 tens. So if I have 5 hundreds, I have 50 tens. And that number is 4 or less. Better let it rest. So 503 rounded to the nearest 10 would round to 500. So it would stay, right? We wouldn't add 1 more. Okay, so that's rounding to the nearest 10. Got lots of word problems. Okay, and you'll notice these are very similar to what we did earlier today, using rounding to decide if an answer is reasonable. So you have to do that first, right? You have to write your estimate by rounding, and then you have to decide if it's reasonable. You are not adding or subtracting what's on the page. You're rounding each of those numbers and then doing that operation to see if that would make sense, right? Let's try to do 2 of them so that you can get some practice. Let's look at number 26. I've got 83 plus 19. So I need to round 83 to the nearest 10. So 83, right, to the nearest 10. Is it going to be 80 or is it going to be 90? It's going to be 80. So I'm going to have 80. And I'm going to add, not 19. I'm going to round 19 to the nearest 10. Ooh, that's 5 or more. I better add 1. So that 19 would round to 20. Okay, so now I can do my operation. 80 plus 20 more. Good mathematician always stacks their numbers, right? You never try to add or subtract going sideways. Zeros. 8 plus 2 more tens gives me 10 tens, which means 100. So there's my estimation, right? I showed my work. They're saying it would be 102. Do you think that's reasonable? Is 102 close to 100? It really is, right? So we're going to write, yes, that's a reasonable answer. Okay, so remember, you're not just simply doing the problem. You're rounding and then doing the problem and then comparing. Is that a reasonable answer? Okay, let's try one more. We're going to do number 28. 468 minus 158 equals 280. So we have to round these numbers first and then do our calculation to see if that is indeed a reasonable answer. So 468, and remember, we're rounding to the nearest 10 in today's lesson. So I'm going to box my tens. I have 46 tens. Is my 46 tens going to stay, or is it going to become 47 tens? Because that's an 8. It's 5 or more. It's going to become 47 tens. 468 rounded to the nearest 10 would be 470. Then I can subtract this rounding number. 15 tens. You're right, it's going to become 16 tens, which is the same as 160. Okay, now I got to figure out my answer. Remember, I'm subtracting this time. I get 310. What do you think? Reasonable? Not reasonable, which would be unreasonable. Do you think 310 is close to 280? I think it is. So I'm going to say yes. It's not too far off, right? Okay, we could have done the same thing, and we could have done it to the nearest 100 and gotten an answer and decided, is it reasonable? Okay, so you're doing two things when you're doing a problem like that. You got to make sure that you follow those directions, all right?